Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Hi, I'm David Naiman, the host of the radio show and podcast Between the Covers. People are often surprised to learn that this is not my day job, that I don't get paid. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm not here to ask you for an income. Up until now, hosting the podcast has involved only nominal fees, but the podcast has seen explosive growth this year. Listenership has quadrupled in less than 10 months, and these once nominal fees have grown to many hundreds of dollars, which could easily become thousands next year and which I'm paying myself. So I'm here today talking to you in the hope of creating a sustainable model for me to nurture the podcast success. If you value these interviews, whether with great fiction writers such as George Saunders, Laurie Moore, or Junot Diaz, science fiction icons Ursula K. Le Guin, William Gibson, and Neil Stephenson, or genre-bending essayists and poets such as Claudia Rankine, Maggie Nelson, and Mary Ruefle, I hope you'll become a patron of Between the Covers. Your per-episode contribution would be your way to participate in the show's long-term health. Please take a moment and either go to Patreon, patreon.com/betweenthecovers, or to davidnaiman.com/support and give your support. And enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, Lina Meruane, is one of the most prominent voices in Chilean literature today. A novelist, essayist, and cultural journalist, she's the author of the short story collection Las Infantas, a book of essays about the portrayal of AIDS in Latin American literature entitled Viral Voyages, and 3 novels, Póstuma, Cercada, and Fruta Podrida. She has received writing grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Arts Development Fund for Chile, and has a doctorate in Latin American literature from New York University, where she serves as a professor of world and Latin American literature and creative writing. Lina Meruane is here today to talk about her first novel, translated into English, Seeing Red, translated by Megan McDowell for Deep Vellum Press, a novel prior to its English translation that received the Anna Segers Literary Prize in Germany and the prestigious Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Prize in Mexico in 2012. Roberto Bolaño described Lina Meruane's prose as having great literary force, emerging from the hammer blows of conscience, but also from the ungraspable and from pain. Enrique Villamatas describes Seeing Red as a novel of genius and disturbing intelligence. The New Yorker says that in Seeing Red, New York and her hometown Santiago are described in prose that blends sensation with memory, fury with fear. The story reveals its truth through the immediacy of description, vicious, repulsive, and beautiful. And Publishers Weekly, in its starred review, says that, blurring the lines between fiction and memoir, Seeing Red explores mortality, identity, and personal transformation. And for English language readers, serves as a stunning introduction to a remarkable author. Welcome to Between the Covers, Lina Meruane.
Thank you.
So the protagonist of Seeing Red, who shares your name, Lina Meruane, she was born with a congenital weakness in her eyes. And the book opens with something that she's long anticipated, a blood vessel bursting in her retina and her starting to lose her vision. When this happens, at the beginning of the book, as a reader, I expect the book to be, this journey into blindness, to be one of touch and sound. And instead, it becomes extremely visual. And I'm curious if you could talk about this. Was this something you anticipated? originally, or was it something that surprised you?
Well, while I was, it's a very good question. Thank you. While I was thinking about writing this book that does start with a personal experience, I went through this sort of ordeal some 15 years ago. And I had thought about writing this novel. I first thought I was going to write a memoir, actually. But then it really went off and it turned into a novel because actually the writing took me there. We can talk more about that if you want later. But in any case, I was thinking about writing this book because I thought the materials, sort of the story was a good story and it was hard. I mean, why wouldn't I use this material, right? So I actually tried it out a couple of times. It didn't really work. And in my mind, it was going to be a very sort of obscure book, literally, right? There's an expression in Spanish, which, by the way, your Spanish is excellent.
Oh, thanks.
So there's an expression in Spanish that says, that's called the novela negra, the black novel, which is really noir, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought, it's going to be like a noir, so to speak, right? But then I realized that everything was actually very visual. Everything that was a memory came back in very visually, to the point that I actually talked to a psychologist in perception, and I said, why is it that I do remember some episodes as if I had seen them while I know that I didn't? And she said, well, it is because when one has seen, even if you can't see anymore for a while, what happens is that the brain sort of fills in, right? Because the image is not created in the eye. The eye is only a receptor. But really, all sensation is sort of created or reproduced in the mind, right? In the brain. And so that kind of gave me some liberty to really sort of explore that. And so while I thought it was going to be sort of a novel only based on other sensations, right, it ended up being a very visual book. And a lot of people have commented on how sort of almost cinematographic it is to read the book. So interestingly, that's the way it turned out to be.
Yeah. And it's interesting also because the character Lina Meruane, she doesn't have absolute blindness. She actually sees the blood essentially in her eye also. Mm-hmm. So she's flooded with visual stimulus, mm-hmm. but it's not actual images that she can interpret in the world.
Yes.
Speaking about the idea of the vision being constructed and part of the brain and part of memory, there's this great quote near the end by the Russian eye doctor that she sees. Mm-hmm. There were no eye banks because no one donated dead eyes. It was believed, said Lex, the eye doctor, that memory lived in them, that the eyes were an extension of the brain peering out through the face to grasp reality. Some people thought the eyes were depositories of memory, he said, and others still believed that the soul was hidden there. It was almost like she was seeing a scientist mystic, mm-hmm. in a way.
Mm-hmm. I think scientists are kind of mystics. I mean, they have replaced our idea of God somehow.
Yeah. No, it's true.
They have that power.
We give them that power too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although I think that also things have changed so much. In general, I've studied the question of medicine for a long time, right? But yes, I think the scientists and doctors used to have sort of this sort of godlike power, but now people have been more empowered too to sort of understand sort of some of the limits that, because you see lots of doctors or because you're able to read about medicine online. So that has also, it's becoming to be contested in good ways and also in some bad ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's this other thing that gets discovered by the character. Her editor, she's a writer, Lina Meruane is a writer in the book, and her editor urges her to continue writing. Mm-hmm. And she wants her to write through dictation. And she realizes that her writing does not come from her ear, but essentially comes from her hand, from the movement of her hand. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? And if that's something you discovered yourself with your episode of blindness? That's a good question. Let me think. So I guess I don't have that relation with my hand in the sense that I don't think that the writing comes from the hand. It's something that my character
believes. Actually, it's interesting that she's actually called Lucina, and she signs her books as Lina, right? So there's a sort of this double identity, sort of my own identity is sort of separated in two, right? The character and her literary persona, right? And so because I really did want to mark the fact that there is sort of a fictional production of a character, although it does start with me, at some point it really goes off. And so this character, Lucina, sees her connection to writing very connected to her body in a very sort of literal way. But I actually do dictate. Like now that I've been here in the Northwest, I asked this editor if I could write a piece on the Northwest. And because I've been sort of traveling and moving around and walking through the cities, what I've done is I've actually dictated to my phone. And that has been really useful because I can't just sit down and write all the time. So I think that I can separate myself from my character in that way, where I can dictate and I cannot see what I'm writing, while my character insists that her writing is connected to her seeing. And this is why she sort of becomes so obsessed with recovering sight. Because if she doesn't recover sight, she can't be who she is.
Right. Well, Seeing Red is often called an autobiographical novel, and for obvious reasons, the protagonist sharing your name, the dual life in New York and Santiago, that you both have a shared profession and a health crisis with your eyes.
Yes.
And as you said at the beginning, that you started this as potentially as a memoir, but it didn't go the way you wanted it to go. So tell us a little bit about the advantages of writing it as somewhere in between a memoir and a novel, in a sense, versus a purely fictionalized novel or a memoir.
So the way I see it is sort of a book that is, yes, as you said, it's not an autobiography. It's also not exactly a purely imaginative fiction, right? We have a term for that. It's called autofiction, and it is when the author brings in her own name to represent herself as other, as somebody who I am not, right? And so I see it sort of moving from the very real to the completely imagined, right? So it's sort of it's not that it's mixed all the time. It's that it starts one place and ends in the other. And it's because I really set out to write a memoir. I really wanted to write in that genre. I wanted to write a very short book that only talked about what had happened. But there had been sort of like maybe 12 years between the actual event and my writing. And so many of the things had been forgotten, and also many of the sort of the real events didn't matter to me so much as sort of the questions that appeared as I wrote. And those questions, I needed to sort of go into the fictional realm in order to sort of figure out what would happen if this character does what she wants to do, which was not me. Right? And so I think that sort of the fiction gave me the liberty to go to places that did not exist in my real life, and to explore questions that I hadn't explored in my experience, right? But sort of gave me that liberty to move forward, right? And so I think that was really useful. I mean, I really discovered how much fiction allows you to take so many liberties.
And were there any touchstone memoirs that you were looking at when you thought it was going to be a memoir project? And likewise, were there any touchstone books of autofiction that were influential for you when reimagining it as an autofiction?
So what I really had in mind, I've said this before, but it's The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, which I read when I was in my 20s, and it was a shocking book. I mean, it's like, and I really went back to that book in my mind because she starts out this autobiographical book about her depression when she comes to New York. She's a young woman who comes to New York, and she says something like, I should be having the time of my life. I'm in New York, and she's deeply depressed. Right. And she starts from there. So there was this sort of eerie connection of me having come to New York where I should have be having the time of my life, and I wasn't actually. I was going through this very difficult period in my life. And so I really connected back to not only to that event in her memoir, but also to sort of the ways in which she talks about depression in this very raw way, to the point that you have a sort of a very physical experience while reading that book. It's like this sort of openness in detail, right, where she really goes, she doesn't sort of save herself. She doesn't show herself under a good light. She really goes into the very sort of extreme events that happened to her there. And then also I was thinking of a very short book by William Styron. I never can remember the title in English because I read it in Spanish, actually. It's Esa visible oscuridad. It's a short memoir on his depression. And I remember also reading it in my 20s and thinking, oh my God, I can't finish this book. I was alone at home, and it was just so physical. I was having all kinds of like physical reactions to that book.
Is it Darkness Visible?
Yes. Thank you. Darkness Visible. And so I really sort of put it down and ended the book the next day and that morning so I could just have some sunlight because it was really intense. And so I really wanted to do that. And that's what I set out to do. But then, as I was saying, new questions and new ideas, and also the ways in which my writing really took on and characters really became fictionalized. And so I really had fun writing the book, instead of like having to go back to only to the saddest part or the difficult parts. It brought in humor, black humor, nasty comments. My character becomes sort of a little bit of an evil being, etc.
Yeah, no, you have this great interview where you interview Enrique Villamatas, who also uses his own name for his protagonist.
Yes. Oh, yeah, you asked me that, and I didn't answer that part.
No, but I was curious about something that you suggested about the ways he used his own name as a device to heighten his writing's characteristic ambiguity, is what you said in the English translation of that interview. Do you think that's true for you too? That it heightens the ambiguity of the writing?
Yes, I do think so. I think that sort of it's sort of an opportunity to play with sort of a lot of elements, and it also sort of creates a distance between the writer outside of the book and the character inside of the book. I think that it used to be the case that people, when they wrote memoir or autobiography, sort of back then, really wanted to present themselves as some sort of hero. And what I find in contemporary autofiction is that actually it's used more to show sort of the obscure and sometimes disgusting and also ambiguous elements in a character that you wouldn't say of yourself sort of publicly, but it allows you to sort of delve into those sort of more complex elements.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to author Lina Meruane about her first book in English, Seeing Red from Deep Vellum. So you mentioned there's two names for your protagonist. I don't know if you in real life have two names, but the protagonist has two names, Lucina and Lina.
Yes.
And I thought a lot about that. And I was wondering if I was reading too much into this, but I'm curious your thoughts. So I was thinking of St. Lucy or Santa Lucia, who gouges out her own eyes. But I was also thinking about Lucy is a word for light.
Yes.
And if you move from Lucina to Lina, in a way you're literally taking the light out of the name. Was this intentional on your part?
Well, it's hard to remember now. I mean, this book has been out in Spanish for a long time, but I have played previously with my own name. There's a previous novel, it's a very, very short novel that I wrote in year 2000, and the character who also resembles a little bit of me is called Lucia. And so I went from Lucia to Lucina. There was this sort of traveling name. I don't know why I had been choosing that, and it's true that it really goes back to the question of light, which here became really relevant. But interesting. I hadn't thought about that, the question of sort of taking the light out of Lina. What is true is that I, as Lina, have been asked a number of times whether my real name is Lina. Because in Spanish, there's a number of names, well, actually in English too, but Carolina, Catalina, Paulina, who are like long names that include Lina, right? And so I've always been asked if this is a short for a longer name, which made me very conscious, really from the start, that sort of what is there in names, right? I mean, is it that my name is sort of a half name? How much of that feels strange as a name that names identity, etc., right? So I've always been very playful and mindful of the use of names. But yes, I didn't really think so much about it, but there is a question of light there. And as I have continued to read on blindness, I did discover, but I didn't know it then when I was writing, that there's a Saint Lucy and Saint Lucilla, right, that actually deal with the question of the eyes. Not only the light, but the sort of taking the eyes off and all of that,
right,
as a sort of sacrifice.
And then you sort of flip that story with the epigram you include of Clemente Palma, the Los Ojos de Lina.
Yes.
That horror. It's very terrifying, that story.
Yeah. Have you read the entire story?
Yeah, that story is terrifying, and it's and Lina that's short for a longer name in that story too, I believe.
I don't remember that part. That's interesting.
I think it's Ahelina or something, or Axelina.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
That's a very good one, actually. But yeah. So let me just tell the story a little bit. So the story of Clemente Palma, who's a well-known modernist writer in Peru, was sent to me many years ago by a friend from Cuba. And he said, "Oh, I think you would really like this short story." I hadn't read it. And it is about a man who is very impressed by his girlfriend's green demonic eyes, right? And it's really described in that way. And when I read it, I felt, oh, there is this sense of her eyes being demonic. What does that mean? And I thought, it doesn't mean that she has some sexual power that he is frightened about. And so what happens is that in the story, when they're going to get married, she actually takes her eyes off and gives them to him as a present, which for me means that she really sort of puts down this power that she has and gives it to him, because when she is going to be married, she's going to lose her power. She's going to give the power to him, which really made me think how much we as sort of a culture, the Western culture, believes that there is power in vision. And if we really go back to Oedipus and Tiresias, it's all about sort of the power of eyes, right? So there's something about this woman giving her power to her husband, right? And sort of becoming sort of a more servile, disempowered woman within marriage, right? So this really made me think, and it was really useful to have. It was really funny that it's Lina's eyes, or the eyes of Lina, in the story, because it gave it sort of another layer of the Linas in the book, right, in and out of the book. But I really also wanted to sort of invert that relation of power, because one of the questions that I did want to explore was the ways in which we think of somebody who is disabled, in this case, blind, right? We think of a blind woman as a powerless woman, right? Somebody, because she has lost her power, she has lost her eyes. And so the question is there any power in this woman? Is it really true that disabled people are powerless? And how much power can they gain precisely of that place of vulnerability? So this was one of the questions that I was really engaged with. And so the sort of the character starts sort of turning the ball around, so to speak.
Yeah.
Throughout.
No, that's great. Let's have our listeners hear a little bit of the prose from Scene Read.
Sure. Okay. So the book is, for people who are listening, the book is written in short fragments. I really tried to think of each fragment as a short scene that would be sort of very sort of intense and strong. So the book actually opens with a moment, this is not a spoiler, of course, the book opens with her going blind, and I'm going to read that first very short fragment. Burst. It was happening. Right then. Happening. They'd been warning me for a long time, and yet. I was paralyzed, my sweaty hands clutching at the air while the people in the living room went on talking, roaring with laughter. Even their whispers were exaggerated, while I. And someone shouted louder than the rest, "Turn the music down. Don't make so much noise or the neighbors will call the cops at midnight." I focused in on that thundering voice that never seemed to tire of repeating that even on Saturdays the neighbors went to bed early. Those gringos weren't night owls like us, party people to the core. Good Protestant folks who would indeed protest if we kept them from their sleep. On the other side of the walls, above our bodies and under our feet, too, these gringos, so used to greeting dawn with their socks on and their shoes already tied, were restless. Gringos who sat down in their impeccable underwear and iron faces to eat their breakfasts of cereal with cold milk. But none of us were worried about those sleepless gringos, their heads buried under pillows, their throats stuffed with pills that would bring no relief as long as we kept trampling their rest. If the people in the living room went on trampling, that is, not me. I was still in the bedroom, kneeling, my arms stretched out towards the floor. In that instant precisely, in that half-light, in that commotion, I found myself thinking about the neighbors' oppressive sleeplessness, imagining them as they turned out the lights after stuffing earplugs in their ears, how they push in so hard the silicone would burst. I thought I would much rather have been the one with broken earplugs, the one with eardrums pierced by shards. I would rather have been the old woman resolutely placing the mask over her eyelids, only to yank it off again and switch on the light. I wish for that, while my still suspended hand encountered nothing. There was only the alcoholic laughter coming through the walls and splattering me with saliva. Only Manuela's strident voice yelling over the noise for the umpteenth time, "Come on, guys, keep it down a little." "No, please don't," I said to myself. "Keep talking, keep shouting, howl, growl if you must, die laughing." That's what I said to myself. My body seized up through only a few seconds had passed. I'd only just come into the master bedroom, just leaned over to search for my purse and the syringe. I had to give myself an injection at 12 o'clock sharp, but now I wouldn't make it because the pile of precariously balanced coats let my purse lie to the floor. Because instead of stopping conscientiously, as I should have, I bent over and reached to pick it up. And then a firecracker went off in my head. But no, it was no fire I was seeing. It was blood spilling out inside my eye. The most shockingly beautiful blood I have ever seen. The most outrageous, the most terrifying. The blood gushed out, but only I could see it. With absolute clarity, I watched as it thickened. I saw the pressure rise. I watched as I got dizzy. I saw my stomach turn, saw that I was starting to retch, and even so, I didn't straighten up or move an inch, didn't even try to breathe while I watched the show, because that was the last thing I would see that night through that eye, a deep black blood.
I've been listening to Lina Meruane read from Seeing Red. You mentioned as an introduction to that reading some of the choices you make in syntax. So there's very short sentences or short sections, and there are fragmentary sections. There's an absence of paragraphs, and sometimes there are sentences that are interrupted that end with before they end, essentially. Can you talk a little bit more about the effect you're trying to create with some of these choices?
Yes, as I started out writing, I really felt that wanted to convey through the syntax what the protagonist is actually feeling. I've always thought that punctuation has to work that way in literature. While there are all these rules of where you put commas and periods and where you cut up paragraphs, etc., I actually never think of punctuation that way. I think about sort of the way the sentence breathes and how it's connected to the body of the protagonist or the narrator. So I really wanted to do that. And I've been working on that sort of in previous books, but here I really got that down because I really wanted to convey a sense that she is left speechless by the event of bleeding into her eye. Sort of this sort of new event leaves her suspended, right? So I really wanted to suspend sentences where they should not. And it was really interesting because the translator had to also deal with the fact that she had to interrupt the sentence somewhere. And of course, the copy editor was intrigued on whether this was bad translation or if that was how it looked like in the original, right? So we really had to be very careful, the translator, the copy editor, and I, to sort of respect that sort of interruption because it can seem bad translation. I mean, especially because it's happening right at the beginning. So you're not, you as a reader don't know.
Right.
And it really reminded me, there's a really wonderful modernist Brazilian author, Clarice Lispector. When I was very young, I lived in Madrid and I worked at the Book Fest in Madrid. And I worked for this very good publishing house who published this writer. And so one of her books started with 3 dots, like an
ellipsis.
Yes, an ellipsis. And that's the way the novel started, right? And so I saw this book because I was a super huge fan, right, of Lispector's work. But then the readers would come back the next day and say, I think there's a problem with the printing. The first page is missing. And so I realized that people were really taken aback by this, and I thought it was really interesting. So then the next days I sold the book as prefacing it by saying, there's no pages missing, this is the way it starts, right? So I was really, I know how sort of punctuation can really set people off and think that there is a mistake. So that is actually very tricky.
And as a fluent English speaker, were you involved at all in the translation of Sangre en el Ojo, or were there any particular debates or disagreements you had with the translator?
Well, I actually trusted, I had to trust Megan, right? My only concern with Megan is that she's a very good translator of Alejandro Zambra's work, another Chilean writer who's very famous, actually. And his style and mine have like nothing in common. So I was at one point thinking, because Alejandro Zambra's work has been described as, her translation of Alejandro Zambra's work has been described as very good. And I thought, is this novel going to sound like somebody else's work?
Right.
So I did read sort of the beginning, the first pages, but I also decided not to read the entire book, just because I am a perfectionist with language. And when I reread my book in Spanish, I want to correct it again, right? And so I thought that I shouldn't do that because it was going to take me forever, and I was I'm so particular with English that I would want to change things that are correctly said in English and try to correct them into things that are not correctly said in English. Because one of my issues with English, I know I'm fluent most of the time, but idioms and expressions are very, very hard to get for a non-native. And so I had to trust that Megan was doing the right thing, sort of turning it into sort of good English rather than sort of the correct English that I have in my mind. And so I really sort of left her work. And then what I did was I answered the 400 questions that were presented to me by both Megan, the translator, and the copy editor. So that's the only moment when I really went, in order to answer a question, I would go back and see if there was a mistake before, a misunderstanding, the use of a false cognate or something like that. And sometimes I did find some little detail that didn't make sense with what was following. And sometimes it was only a question of like a comma, a period,
I listened to
confirmation. Yes.
an interview with her where she said that the most difficult thing for her was the title. Maybe because
Yes.
maybe because it is an idiom in Spanish.
It is.
It can mean being angry.
Yes.
And in
exactly.
English, blood in the eye wouldn't really convey that like
Yes.
Seeing Red would.
But that's what I wanted as the title.
Blood in the eye?
Yes, that's what I wanted. And then everybody was saying, like, it's a terrible title. And I'm like, well, but it's very literal.
Right.
So you see, so the thing is, like, becomes very literal with one's own work. And because Seeing Eye didn't say anything to me, I mean, I don't know that expression. So it sounded like a very sort of foreign thing.
Yeah.
It didn't make sense to me.
That's fascinating.
Yes. But then everybody has commented on how good the title is. And so I'm actually very glad that I, let Megan do her work.
You mentioned earlier how this book interrogates illness narratives, among
Yes.
other things, and also in a gender-specific way as well as more in general.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the ways Seeing Red really becomes a surprising and compelling and unique book. And there's one interview where you described it as about the cruelty of being taken care of and the predatory nature of those who are in need. And I love that flipping of the power dynamic, because in a sense, Lina is refusing to be helpless. And in a way, the people who want to help her become burdens in the book. But
Yes.
not only burdens to her, it also crosses over and becomes unclear who the victim is, because her boyfriend, Ignacio, really is someone who's willing to do a lot of sacrifice on her behalf.
Yes.
And she ends up essentially exploiting that tendency in him.
Yes.
And so the question of victimhood and power becomes very unclear to the point where it almost feels like we're moving into horror.
Yes. Well, actually, while I was writing the book, one of the questions was, where is this book going? Because I had separated myself from my own experience, I was sort of left maybe at the first third of the book with, wait, so what is going to happen, right? And as I continued to write, I didn't really know, and I was really sort of at a loss. But then I realized that this was what actually I was trying to do, figure out sort of how sort of the victim and the victimary were tied into this sort of slave-master relation, which is also the relation between the disabled and the one who takes care of her in this case, right? And so I figured out, and then I sort of went back into the story of Clemente Palma, etc., and I thought, yes, what this is actually, it's a horror novel, right? It's really going into that direction, and this is where I felt like, okay, so now I know what I'm doing, going from memoir to horror novel, and I let it go, and I really went in that direction. It was really the place where I really started to enjoy the book.
I bet.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because despite its horror elements, your translator thinks that Seeing Red is a love story at its heart. And I'm curious if you think it's a love story at its heart as well.
I do think that there is a question posed on love relations. As you were saying before, yes, those who try to help her are a burden. They're also sort of taking away her chances of learning to live in this new situation because they're trying to overprotect her. So love can be very, what's the word for this? Suffocating. So on the one hand, so the question of, love, this wonderful thing. Yes, this wonderful thing. But then also love can be suffocating on the one hand. Mother's love, unconditional love, the promises of love, all of that can be very dangerous. So I did think of this book as a book that explores relations that are mediated by the idea of love. But then I also wanted to interrogate what that means. So is love always a good thing? How much of love is good and how much it becomes like a bad thing, suffocating, or even a tool to manipulate others? And it usually has been the case that it has been women who fall in love and they really fall into like this hole, right, where they can't escape. They're kind of trapped by love. So I really wanted to look at how this could be also inverted. And I think one of the sort of shocking elements of the book is that the character of Ignacio is so servile. He's so loving that he becomes sort of this victim of her because he's so loving. So he is trapped in the ways that we usually see women trapped in love.
Mm-hmm. And just out of curiosity, I don't know if you're married or have a partner, but do you have a partner named
I
Ignacio?
do. No, not naming Ignacio. No
Okay.
character in the book carries their name, their original name, because it is true that there are some sort of real friends and family members, but I did build characters out of them.
Right.
So they don't carry their names just to signal that it is not them, right? And so my partner was waiting for me to finish the book, I think impatiently, because he knew what the book was about. But I really don't share until books are finished. And so he was kind of waiting. And then I said, well, the book is ready. Why don't you read it? And so he read it really like in a wink. And he came back to me and said that he had been a little terrified of how I had sort of portrayed our relationship, and then had seen that he didn't feel identified at all with that character, and that he could sort of see the real events and how I had sort of worked over them and sort of created so many layers upon layers that everything had turned into something else. So I think he was quite delighted and relieved when reading the book. And he actually really liked sort of how things had turned out. But interestingly, his family members didn't like the character and were kind of annoyed by the fact that the partner in the book, Ignacio, is so weak. Like they were like angered by like, oh, why did she, produce this character out of you instead of sort of a better, more heroic,
right,
more strong character.
Huh.
But he didn't have an issue. I mean, he's a good reader. Also, he understands sort of what literature is doing in contrast to real life.
Well, I don't know if you see an affinity between these two things, but I also read Viral Voyages, your scholarly work on AIDS as portrayed in Latin American literature. And I felt like there, in many ways, a great affinity between these two books. And one of the ways is this flip in the power dynamic, that you're telling stories of AIDS survivors with agency and with power to tell their own story. Do you see a relation between the books in some?
Well,
regard?
I actually, so I came to the United States to pursue a PhD, right? And I had set out to write a dissertation on the representation of AIDS, as you were saying. But while I was doing that and reading for that project, I wrote 2 novels. So one of them is Fruta Podrida, Rotten Fruit, and the other one is Seeing Red. So basically in 10 years of work, I was reading mostly narratives of people undergoing diseases, sort of testimonials or fictional works. And so I find that these 3 books somehow are a involuntary trilogy, I call it, taking sort of a phrase by Mario Levrero, a Uruguayan writer. So that it's sort of a trilogy. It's like these 3 books are nurtured by all that reading and thinking that I was doing. The 2 novels are actually quite different. They're really exploring the same question, but the answers that the novels bring are the opposite. So in Rotten Fruit, the question of how do people sort of respond to the call of health is of resistance. So the character there sort of doesn't want to get her health back and resists that. In Seeing Red, on the other hand, it's the opposite. It's, okay, so I have been promised health by the institution. I want to get it back. I'm going to make sure I get it back, right? I recover. So they're really sort of they're sort of books that mirror each other in sort of strange ways. And in the middle of those 2 is my dissertation, Viral Voyages, right? That now is a book. And I was looking at sort of power relations and how, but mostly at how those men sort of narrated their diseases. And there's one very interesting case, Reinaldo Arenas, the Cuban writer, who became very famous. He lived in New York, and he wrote a very famous memoir called Before Night Falls, where he actually accuses Fidel Castro of having put him in danger by throwing him into exile into New York, where he got sick, right? And so, but he was also writing, at the same time that he was writing his memoir, obsessively, a novel. like a 500 pages novel, which takes on the same materials of his memoir or his autobiography and turns it into the craziest novel. And so I was really interested in the ways that you can use these materials in sort of multiple ways, right? So I kind of did that, the same thing, but sort of in one book instead of two.
Yeah. In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to writer Lina Meruane about her book, Seeing Red. Another thing that made me think of Seeing Red in Viral Voyages was this idea of the female disappearance syndrome, the exclusion of the female body as represented in AIDS narratives.
Yes.
And you mentioned Clarice Lispector. We had a couple months ago, Idra Novi, the translator for Clarice Lispector, was a guest. And her book, her first novel, was Ways to Disappear, which looked into both political disappearance in Latin America, but also the disappearance of women in narrative. But there's also, if we think about this in terms of like what is seen and what is unseen and blindness within narrative, it feels like there's this connection also in the way in which Lina, the character, refuses to disappear.
Yes.
She refuses to fall into a category and disappear in the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I'm very interested in that sort of issue, and true that I wrote a whole chapter of Viral Voyages, sort of really looking into what had happened to women in the AIDS crises, not only here, because that's also happened here, but in Latin America, and also in how the fiction, all those novels actually make the women disappear. The women, or what femininity means as a value, as a tenderness, motherhood, etc., or how it's turned into some sort of negative thing, as if the women were those who carry the virus and infect men. I mean, there was many ways in which anything that signified feminine was turned into either an absent thing or a bad thing, right? So I'm very aware of sort of gender politics in narrative, not only in the books, but also outside of the books, where it's sort of harder to be a women writer than a man. So all of these things, I think, also somehow, but I wasn't so conscious of that. I mean, I didn't want to write a thesis into my novel. It's really a kind of different object, right? But I was interested, and I've always been interested in how sort of women circulate, how they're seen, how they're empowered. Now, on a contradictory side, the protagonist of Seeing Red is also a very sort of negative character in the way that she can become very mean and very manipulative, right? So I'm also not trying to produce some sort of ultra-feminist rendering of a woman character in the way that she's heroic and epic and good, right? So I'm also questioning those roles. I mean, I'm not just sort of trying to produce a good feminine character.
I would love to pivot from here and talk a little bit about setting, setting in relationship to things that get disappeared in narratives. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is this book takes place in Santiago and in New York City. Mm-hmm. And there's sort of a double vision for our narrator around these two places, but they feel you link them around the event of 9/11 or two events of 9/11 because they both have deep historical significance for their respective countries. But it's also interesting how I'm guessing most of our listeners don't know that there are two 9/11s, which is another way in which one narrative dominates over another narrative in a way.
Yes.
Can you talk about the use of 9/11 in Seeing Red and how it connects the two lands?
Yes, it's a very good question. Actually, the mirror effect of 9/11 was in the original manuscript more visible, and I kind of made it disappear a little bit just because I felt that it could be read as an opportunistic element in the book. So it's more subtle in what turned out to be the published novel. But I did want to sort of just slightly draw the line and sort of, because there's this thing about doubling, right? There's two eyes, and so there's also two spaces, two people, two histories that are really deeply connected. Because, yes, there's the 9/11 that sort of marks or commemorates the day of the military coup that deposed the socialist president, Salvador Allende, right? And marked the beginning of a very long and terrible dictatorship, which is the time I was growing up. Right, I was 3 years old by the time of the coup. But then, so I had just sort of arrived to my life, so to speak. I was 3 years old when that 9/11 happens. But then when I came to New York, I had just arrived to sort of this new life, right? And then there's another 9/11. Where there's also an interesting sort of mirror effect is that these two 9/11s are connected sort of also politically, because 9/11, the Chilean 9/11 was supported, right, and even sort of pushed by the United States, right? All those Latin American dictatorships were really an effect of North American politics, right? And so there's a sense of like, oh, this happened back then, and then I'm coming to the United States and it's happening again, but it's the enemies of the United States who are actually producing this 9/11, right? So it's just sort of thrown very sort of subtly in there. You're a very good reader, so you followed that line, David. But so I really wanted to sort of mark that because it was sort of a shocking kind of sense of, here we go again, another 9/11.
And there's a way in which both New York and Santiago actually feel like they become characters in the book to me. And what I mean is...
How so?
Well, because for one thing, Lina, in her descriptions of the world, lots of things end up having eyes. So fingers have eyes. We notice the eyes in paintings, but the double holes where the Twin Towers were are described like eyes, and the bullet holes in the walls from bazooka fire in Santiago feel like eyes. And they not only feel like eyes, they feel like the cities are becoming witnesses to something. So in a strange way, it feels there's this... eerie animism that happens with the landscapes in the book.
Just to add to that, it's actually, for me, the image is that the cities, more than witnesses, have become blinded. Because those bazooka holes in the buildings, she thinks of them, and it's actually true, that the government palace was bombed and destroyed, but then also sort of redone. But those other buildings weren't. So you still can see those bazooka holes in some of those nearby buildings, right? So she thinks of those buildings as how her retinas must look, like retinas filled with holes. So it's like those buildings have been blinded. At the same time, the Twin Towers are two important buildings that disappeared. So, and it's also the fact that the Twin Towers have been taken out of the skyline, as if like eyes taken out of a face, right? So there's sort of this blinding effect where I think it's mostly because she is always constantly projecting on the outside what is happening in the inside. So there's a sort of this, everything becomes very subjective. Even the rendering of landscape becomes a part of her own body.
Yeah, it does feel like there's this collapse of exterior and interior.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, with all of this eye imagery, it also made me think of this quote again from Viral Voyages of a medical linguist, Paula Treichler, who says, "AIDS is an epidemic of signification. It requires an attentive gaze. The language of metaphor less reflects the reality of the disease than it symbolically constructs it. And these rhetorical mechanisms can lead to terrible social realities around the response to the disease. Metaphors of an epidemic are as contagious as the disease itself." So in a sense, the language of the disease spreads with the disease, with potential pitfalls of metaphor, which made me wonder what thought process you went through in regards to using and avoiding metaphor in seeing red.
Yes, actually, it's a very, very good question. I was very interested in not only what Paula Treichler says, I really like her work, but also Susan Sontag really was sort of somebody who put out there the question of the use and the misuse of metaphors in those two books that she wrote, one on cancer and the other one on AIDS, sort of separated by 10 years. I think it was 1978 and 1988. And these are really good books because she really talks about how metaphors become sort of the worst part of a disease, where people are really blamed or sort of they're thrown all these metaphors where they can't really escape what language is doing to their own realities. And so while the other novel that I wrote, the other novel of the trilogy, Rotten Fruit, is a sort of very allegorical novel, this one, actually, I was really trying to escape the work of metaphor. So I really wanted to write a very literal book. I think readers can sort of read metaphors into it, but I was sort of conscientiously trying not to write metaphorically here. I was trying to be very, very literal. I mean, as far as you can, because interestingly, Susan Sontag was accused, right? Everybody said, like, you can't write without metaphors. And when she wrote the second part of the book in 1988, she said, of course, we can't write without metaphors. Metaphors are part of language. So I'm aware of that, right? But she said, the question is trying to avoid bad metaphors. So anyway, I was trying to avoid metaphors. I'm sure there's plenty of them in the book because you can't really avoid them.
Especially with the eye and vision. Like,
yes.
That's so, it almost feels like metaphors are inherent to the eye at this point.
But at the same time, there's been many, many books written about blindness that are really sort of conveying the metaphors of power and vision and all kinds of ideas. So I was trying really to sort of not do that.
Yeah. Well, there were other ways, and not looking for metaphors, but for looking in connections to your body of work. When I was reading Seen Read, we do see appearances of AIDS survivors, minor characters, a couple times in the book.
Yes.
One who's lost vision in an eye from a stroke from the disease. But I also wondered about, I felt like we saw other concerns of yours from your career in Seen Read too. For instance, there's the pressures of her family in Chile to have a child, and it made me think of Contra los Hijos, where you examine the pressures for women to become mothers.
Yes.
And then also I wondered if this was too much of a stretch, but there's a sense of exile in the book, I feel, for Lina, that she has two homes, but in a way she has no home. Mm-hmm. And I know your latest book in Spanish, and I hopefully it will come out at some point in English, is about you exploring your Palestinian heritage.
Yes.
And I wondered if that was perhaps a nod to some of that homelessness and a looking for home that happens in Seen Read.
All the books are somehow connected because they're all connected less to your biography and more to your obsessions. So for me, it's like I was writing Seen Read, and I was starting to take notes for this other book against daughters and sons, I think would be the translation for Contra los Hijos. I wasn't thinking at all about the Palestinian book that really came almost like an accident. I went to Palestine and then started writing that book, sort of once I was there, sort of almost like dictating the book. So I wasn't really aware of that. But I do think that once you leave your country, you become very sensitive and very aware of sort of the sense of homelessness. I'm not thinking of homelessness as a necessarily evil thing. I think that it really does make you aware of what sort of the sense of what refugees go through and people who are evicted from their homes. And so you sort of like this, this antenna comes up and you become very, very attentive to those realities. So I think that somehow the experience of having left Chile, as also my grandparents left Palestine, and sort of relocating in New York with a husband who is also somebody who has relocated from Spain to New York, and also having only friends that also have relocated from other places, right, really does give you a sense of all these places you belong to, and at the same time you don't. Yeah. So there are sort of I do have a sense also that while my books are very different in even the style, they are connected through sort of a line of obsessions. And actually, the book that I'm writing right now also comes back to the question of childless women.
What can you talk a little bit about your new project?
I can't really, not because I don't want to, but because I don't really know at this point where it's going. But it does. have as a protagonist a Bolivian woman who's a sort of displaced person in Chile who has decided to leave her children for a number of reasons, which are not so clear right now. And there is a connection between that and that old war between Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. That is a 19th century war that where the new frontiers were to be decided, sort of very unjustly for Bolivians, actually, who were left without an outlet to the ocean. But also sort of the current tensions between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, right, as a sort of ongoing war.
And can you speak a little more about the Palestinian book as well? In reading about it, I was surprised to learn that Chile has the largest Palestinian community outside of the Middle East, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what happened is that Palestinians started leaving that area when they were under the Ottoman Empire. Not only Palestinians, but what now are the Lebanese and Syrians, right? That whole area was taken by the Turks. And so the Christian communities mostly were under threat, and they were forced to do military service. They were also sent sort of in the vanguard, so there were cannon fodder, etc. So people started leaving that area, and many of them moved to the United States and to Latin America. Somehow, and it's not clear how that happened, many of them ended up in Chile. So that's the story of my grandfather and my grandmother, who were actually born in the same town, but actually met in Chile. But the assimilation that was happening at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that immigration really assimilated quickly. They really wanted to leave behind the situation they had lived, and they wanted to make sure that the children would adapt and become sort of have more opportunities in the place where they were, right? And so assimilation was very quick, and languages were lost, etc. So my father grew up as a Chilean, and I grew up as a ultra Chilean, so to speak, right? I mean, I knew that there was this Palestinian thing in my family, but I wasn't politicized. I wasn't sort of raised in a Palestinian identity, as a lot of people are in Chile, actually, but not me. So when I came to the United States, precisely at the point of the fall of the Twin Towers, I did have a very acute sense of how Muslims were portrayed and how Palestinians were portrayed. I was watching TV 24 hours, and you would see the towers come down, then you would see Arafat saying, "I'm shocked," and then you would see 5 seconds of Palestinian children celebrating something. And this was sort of repeated over and over again, as if the media was producing this idea that it was the PLO that actually had done this. So there wasn't anybody faulted yet, but the TV already had a thesis. And I felt strangely scared because I thought, oh, but these are my people somehow, right? I mean, I don't know them, but that's where my grandparents came from. So that gave me a sense of like, oh, I'm a foreigner here. Not only am I a Chilean, but I'm also Palestinian, and somehow I'm being accused of this. What could this mean? So that really sort of woke me up from sort of a more happy assimilation back in Chile. And so when I got to Israel many years later, I ended up almost by chance, and sort of the story of how I got there is told in the book, which hopefully will come out in English and will be called Becoming Palestine. When I got there, actually, I was at Heathrow trying to get to Tel Aviv, and I took the Israeli airline, El Al. And of course, it's not really stewardesses who are working there. It's actually the security police, right? And I was really recognized as a Palestinian, a Chilean Palestinian. I was interrogated. It was an ordeal. I never saw the airport. I was like in this small room 3 hours before the plane left. And I really got on the plane with a passport. I know this is something that a lot of people suffer because the security level is very high, and usually security is very paranoid. They see terrorists everywhere. But it was sort of, it really also opened my eyes. And when I got there, I was already writing that book about sort of the sense of how hard it is for a Palestinian, even for a third-generation Palestinian or a second-generation Palestinian, to return, because that is legally forbidden. And how also the question of returning has been sort of the main thing in the agenda for the Jewish who became Israelis in 1948, or even still today, right? So the word return carries a lot of weight. So I really worked on that idea of returning and the impossibility to return. Because where do you return to if you've never been there? You personally. Mm-hmm. And if you can't see your grandfather's home because it doesn't exist or it has been taken by others, is that really yours, right? And all these sort of really complicated questions about essence and nationhood and belonging, etc., and becoming or being. And it was really more than a nostalgic return to a place that wasn't really mine. It was more about a sort of a very sharp connection to the current, present politics of the place. So that's really what the book is about.
Wow. I really hope it does come out in English.
We'll see.
It was great having you on Between the Covers today, Lina.
Oh, thank you so much.
We were talking today to Chilean writer Lina Meruane about her first English translated book, Seeing Red, from Deep Vellum Press. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. If you enjoyed today's program, consider supporting the show by going to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And also while you're there, check out the growing archive of bonus material available. Thanks for listening.